The Long Island Sound, it's a national treasure of the United States. But 9 miles north of this Long Island beach on which I'm standing at Wading River and 11 miles south of Connecticut across the Long Island Sound, a huge gas terminal is being planned. It's a project of Broadwater Energy, the creation of TransCanada and Shell Oil. Here's how Broadwater itself describes the project. The Broadwater FRSU is the company's acronym for Floating Storage Regasification Unit, would be about 1,200 feet long and 180 feet wide with a basic hull design similar to a large ocean-going ship. The FSRU is roughly as long as the cruise ship Queen Mary II, which is 1,132 feet long, or an aircraft carrier like the USS Enterprise, which is 1,100 feet long. The company further says the Broadwater terminal will have a capacity of 8 billion cubic feet of gas, and tankers would come into the Long Island Sound every 2 or 3 days to offload gas onto the terminal. From the terminal, the gas would come to shore through pipes. Peter, you conducted a vigil for a month on the beach just opposite where the Broadwater facility is to be placed. Why?
Well, it's my deepest feeling that the Broadwater issue violates the integrity of Long Island Sound. And so I took as a model John Muir. And John Muir in 1903 invited President Teddy Roosevelt to go to California to take a look at the wilderness area there. And that's one of the main reasons how we got the Yosemite National Park. I went there to honor Long Island Sound. I went there to invite Governor Spitzer to come and camp with me along Long Island Sound and to kayak out into the Sound to feel the special beauty of that area and also to feel the spiritual essence of Long Island Sound. I feel that if the governor makes this decision in a back room, it will not be inclusive. If the governor is going to be fair, if he's going to be just and inclusive, he has to come out to Long Island Sound in order to feel this beauty and spiritual essence so that he can make a decision that will include those factors.
And do you feel that, this beauty must exclude Broadwater? There could be no coexistence of the Broadwater facility and the Long Island Sound as we know it?
No, I think Broadwater, in the political sense, is turning Long Island Sound into a third world country. What Broadwater is doing very clearly is the beginning of the privatization and the corporatization of Long Island Sound. Broadwater is the first step. There will be more to come if Broadwater comes into Long Island Sound. And including in that is that Broadwater will have a private security force. And that security force will mean that there will be armed boats in Long Island Sound protecting corporate interests, violating this public treasure. And so we'll see the militarization of Long Island Sound. This is the beginning of the end of Long Island Sound if Broadwater comes in there.
Peter, you've been involved in energy issues for decades. You were a major opponent of the Shoreham nuclear plant project. What about the argument by the Broadwater people that the energy that would be provided, the gas that would be provided by this facility is needed?
You know, this is really a hoax. Broadwater is going to tie us to some of the most dangerous spots in the world, for example, Nigeria, for the next 50 years or so. What Broadwater will do, natural gas is a global warming gas. It will enhance global warming. It will tie us to all the places in the world we don't want to be tied to. We'll see our grandchildren fighting in fossil fuel wars. This idea is really absolute madness, and the government must put a stop to it.
What do you think should be the alternative to this project?
I think there's a very clear alternative, and that is to have a Broadwater-sized investment in energy efficiency and conservation. That will provide us, it will lessen our demand for energy to a far greater extent than Broadwater is ever going to provide.
The proponents, Steve, of the Broadwater facility say that it would provide an important energy source for Long Island. You've been opposed to Broadwater. I mean, is that a good thing?
Well, there are a lot of reasons to be against Broadwater. Number one, we have to be for something, but there is the Islander East project and the Iroquois pipeline coming across that will give us an ample supply of the natural gas that we need. The irony about Broadwater is we're the ones in Suffolk County, throughout Long Island Sound, that has to host this industrialization of our sound. We get very little benefit out of it, however. We get maybe 15% of the capacity of that barge. The rest of it's going to Connecticut, New York City, and elsewhere, yet we have to deal with the environmental consequences and the other consequences as well. The safety issue, who's paying for that? Broadwater will tell you they will. What are you going to do? You're going to farm out security to a private firm? I don't think so. Are they going to reimburse us totally? I believe that when I see it. But the thing that most concerns me is the fact that it sucks in a great deal of water from the Long Island Sound and actually heats it up by up to 4 degrees. And that could have a major impact on the ecosystem of the Sound, of which we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars to revitalize. So after all of this great investment from the state, the federal, and the local level to revitalize the Sound, do we really want to industrialize it and possibly wipe out those gains in one fell swoop? I don't think so. We don't need it. It's not necessary. There are better ways.
Do you think the terrorism threat when it comes to Broadwater is a real thing or some sort of scare story?
Well, you know, what's important to note is not just that some rogue terrorist might try to ram this barge, but what has to be understood is that there has to be a huge perimeter, a safety area that is off limits around the barge to all of our other boats in the area. Our industrial boats, our commercial boats, our recreational boats. A good part of the Long Island Sound is now going to be off limits. It's not just the immediate surrounding area around this barge. It's a huge area. We have to sacrifice for a private enterprise? I don't think that makes very much sense.
The government process in terms of the approval or disapproval of Broadwater, you've been an official a long time. What do you think of the process?
Well, you know, I've been in office for 21 years, and I came into office on the heels of the great debate with Shoreham. And we remember what it was like to have this behemoth of a monopoly, this faceless bureaucracy called FEMA and FERC, these two different agencies in the federal government that tried to ram Shoreham's nuclear power down our throat. We fought, we won. And now we see the federal government once again ignoring local will. Just about every elected official in the area is opposing it, yet they're going forward anyway. I'm not so sure they're going to be successful. It's going to be a fight, but we're going to, you know, if we have to bring a lawsuit to enact what we think is still valid law in the Navigation Act of New York State, which allows Suffolk to control navigation on its waterways, we will enact that law. So eventually this is going to the courts, and some judges will make the ultimate decision if elected officials on the state level don't pull the plug first.
Adrian, the people behind Broadwater say that the energy that it would provide is necessary.
Actually, what we're saying is that, number one, is that it's never really been proven that this region needs 1 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day. Number two is, even if that was true, we're looking for energy infrastructure that has the least damage to our environment, not the most damage to our environment, which is what Broadwater brings us. There are other technologies and other ways to supply energy without destroying an estuary of national significance, which is what the Long Island Sound is.
The Broadwater people again maintain that, relatively speaking, this does not present a huge environmental threat to the region.
Well, actually, this is a huge environmental threat to the region. Number one is that it really adds another nail in the coffin to the ailing lobster industry. Number two is that it adds another nail in the coffin to our commercial fishing industry. Number three is that it sets a horrific precedent of turning over a public natural resource to a privately owned multinational corporation. That's a precedent we won't be able to go back from. It's the wrong precedent. this project will deteriorate the water quality in the Long Island Sound and impact other water-dependent uses. Those are the wrong things for this estuary of national significance.
You've been speaking out against Broadwater all over the place,
Yes.
but the process seems to be, well, skewed towards Broadwater and other promoters of LNG facilities around the country.
The process is very skewed. It's crazy, actually. FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, is known as what's called the lead agency. FERC is a federal agency whose job it is to put in natural gas infrastructure. FERC has never seen a liquefied natural gas facility that they don't like. There's about 50 applications across our nation for large-scale LNG facilities. FERC has approved 18 out of 19 which have already come before them. And the only one they didn't approve was one in the middle of a neighborhood because they were concerned about the damage it could do to the nearby community. So, we really see that the cards are stacked against us. Shell Oil has the money, they have the power, they have the influence, and the agencies are clearly favoring this kind of an industry. But what we do have is that we have the voters, we have the public, we have the elected officials. We have on our side what we believe is the right argument, and that is that this is the wrong project in the wrong place. And we've worked so very hard to preserve the Long Island Sound over the last 10 years. The public has actually spent, believe it or not, over $1 billion on protecting the Long Island Sound between federal, state, and local agencies. And we didn't all agree to spend $1 billion to protect the Long Island Sound in order to turn it over to a multinational corporation. And we need to really work to preserve what few natural resources we have left. We should not be turning them over into these multinational corporations because we'll never get them back. Once we start that process, these resources will be lost forever. We shouldn't let that happen.
Now, the state of New York appears to have some clout on this process. What do you think about what Governor Eliot Spitzer might do?
Well, the state of New York really holds a very key trump card. They hold a card that says, will they rule that this is consistent or inconsistent with a federal law in the way we manage our waterways? We're very nervous. Clearly, we believe this law, which is called the Coastal Zone Management Act, is one that requires the state to evaluate how any project would impact traditional water uses like fishing and lobstering and recreational boating use and other water-dependent endeavors. There's no way Broadwater meets the mandate of this law. Broadwater should be ruled as being inconsistent with this law. However, we're still very nervous on what Governor Eliot Spitzer will do. And he's not indicated one way or the other, and we're nervous.
Broadwater has been, well, rather aggressive in its push for its facility.
This is absolutely the battle, classic battle between David and Goliath. Shell Oil is the Goliath. They have, billions of dollars at their disposal to fight for this project. This project, the initial cost will cost them somewhere between $700 million and $800 million to construct the facility, but it stands to gain them billions of dollars of net profits over the next 20 to 30 years. That's a lot of money for us to be up against. It's a great deal of money. There isn't a stronger opponent. There isn't a more well-funded operation on the globe. So they've been aggressive, they've been spending a lot of money, and this is a really hard battle. Bottom line to this whole project is that we understand that change is inevitable, but change doesn't have to come at the cost of losing what it is we love. We understand that we need more energy, not only just on Long Island, but throughout the state of New York. But those energy plans should be plans that preserve the natural resources and preserve what the community values. We have lost so much here on Long Island with high taxes and congestion and traffic and really just being so overpopulated. What we don't need to lose is more. We don't need to lose the value of our estuaries. And that's what we're fighting for. This one estuary, the Long Island Sound, generates $8 billion per year into our regional economy. That's an awful lot of money. That is an economic engine. To have Shell Oil industry come in and disrupt that economic and environmental treasure is just plain wrong. That's what the fight's about.
Bob DeLuca, president of the Group for the East End. Why are you against this Broadwater project?
I think the simple point from our standpoint is that really Broadwater creates a more industrialized sound than we want to see. We've spent millions of dollars trying to clean up the sound, and parking a big LNG tanker in the middle of it doesn't make a lot of sense from the standpoint of all the money that's been invested to keep it clean. The other thing is that if you live out on eastern Long Island, you realize that these super tankers are going to be coming very close to the shoreline, and Broadwater tells us that their terminal is going to be well offshore. Well, it's not going to be well offshore when those large tankers are coming in past Plum Island, past Fisher's Island, and right into the eastern basin of the Sound. And we have a lot of safety and security concerns that we've articulated to the Coast Guard, articulated to FERC, and we're very hopeful that people will start looking at that, because we think that these tankers are easy targets for enemies of the United States and terrorists, and we think that once you really take a look at it, nobody wants to put that kind of a risk out in the East End.
You've got involved in the process, as you say. You've issued statements and you've gone to these governmental agencies to object to the Broadwater project. Do you think anybody's listening?
Well, we always hope so, otherwise we wouldn't participate. But I think the concern that we really have is that much of the environmental impact statement was written in a conclusory way, which basically kind of tells us that Broadwater is fine, and any of the questions that you have can be dealt with later on in the process. The environmental impact statement is supposed to be the time when you actually get to those questions and figure out the answers, and we were concerned by much of the document really pushing off till some later time some of the most critical issues. We were also concerned by the safety and security report that we looked at very carefully, and some of the statements that were made in there were illogical, if not downright absurd. I mean, we saw things in there where the Coast Guard was saying that that this facility would not be a terrorist target because it wouldn't be close enough to media and there wouldn't be enough loss of life, and you can find that right in the document. Well, you're about 10 minutes or 15 minutes by helicopter from New York City, and it seems to me that the media could get out to that site pretty darn quickly if anything were to happen. We remember Flight 800 and how quickly the media came to that event, and that was 20 miles offshore. Also, the issue of loss of life I don't think really matters from the standpoint of the interest of terrorists. You know, the U.S. Coal lost about 24 individuals, but it was a very severe attack. And just because you don't have a large body count doesn't mean that a spectacular attack on something like Broadwater wouldn't be satisfying to those who are, trying to perpetrate terrorism against the United States.
Do you think the company that's in back of Broadwater is taking the problem of terrorism seriously?
Well, I think a lot of it they have deferred off to the Coast Guard and said, listen, this is the Coast Guard's problem. We'll do what they tell us to do. And frankly, I think one of the biggest issues here is that there are 40-odd applications floating around on both coasts of the United States for LNG terminals. There's no coordinated plan by the federal government as to where these things should be located, and it really is just sort of like a land rush to see who can get their tanker or their platform in the ground first. The folks from Broadwater have even agreed with me that it might make sense for this to happen, but that's not the rules as they see it. So you have a lot of corporate interests trying as hard as they can to get through the process and get their terminals in, and there's no coordinated effort that we can see. And we've asked actually in our comments that this be looked at to figure out where these facilities, if they need to be constructed, should be constructed based on a national safety and security profile rather than the safety and security profile for each individual application.
Walter Gazzari, you're a proponent of the Broadwater project. You think it's going to be okay?
Well, a proponent isn't the word I'd use. I'm just a realist, and I'm a business owner, and I have 70 employees in Greenport. We use a lot of energy, and I think any sensible person who looks at the product that is being proposed here, which is a large supply of natural gas for our region, has to be impressed by the practical advantages of that in this particular energy market that we find ourselves in. We're at the end of an island. We're not the first stop on the end of the pipeline. Our energy costs a lot. We don't have a good natural gas supply out here. Natural gas itself is exactly what it is, what it says. It's a natural product. It comes from the earth, from the middle of the earth, thousands of feet below, and it's pure and it's clean and it's a available resource in great abundance. I don't see why we don't use it.
But one of the issues raised, terrorism. Now, your company in Greenport, one of its focuses these boats that will be used by special forces, sort of like small submarine. In other words, you are involved in this situation we're in these days.
Yes.
And don't you see a huge ship full of natural gas sitting there in the Long Island Sound Don't you see that as being a terrorist target?
I don't see that at all. There are so many of these all over the world that why would the terrorists choose this one? And secondly, put yourself in the mindset of a terrorist. How do you attack something 7 miles out in the middle of the ocean? They don't have those kinds of resources. They can drive a car into a crowded marketplace. They can't drive anything into a ship at sea. They don't have ships. They don't have aircraft. Terrorists are not high technology in that sense. They don't go after very, very difficult targets. They go into easy targets. And they just got lucky on 9/11 because they didn't plan to take down the World Trade Center. They just planned to hit it with some airplanes and make a statement. But they got lucky and they took them down for architectural, structural reasons that they didn't have any understanding of. So I think what we have to look at is terrorist targets. I mean, they're going to be hitting the malls in this country, the shopping malls, with car bombs long before they hit large multi-hulled vessels at sea. I can guarantee that.
But it's not going to be in the ocean. It's going to be in the Long Island Sound, 9 miles from Wading River, from Rocky Point. I mean, I don't want to give anybody any ideas, but all they'd have to do is to get a boat and take it from Wading River or Rocky Point and
do what? I mean, there's a lot of boats. You say it's so easy, you just take a boat. You know, you're talking about taking down a 900-foot, multi-hundred-ton steel, multi-hulled vessel. I think that's something for a military, for an army to do, not for a couple of guys in a boat. It just doesn't happen that way. I think you're not. I think it's not very well informed to even propose that a bunch of guys, with religious objectives are going to take down that particular target. And of course, what's that going to get them? So let's say they hit that. That's not going to hurt Manhattan. It's not going to hurt anybody, really. It's going to be some localized kind of occurrence, and what? It isn't going to affect anyone. As a matter of fact, from what I can tell, it'll make a lot of people happy.
Fred Thiel, what do you think of the Broadwater project?
I think the Broadwater project is the single worst idea for a project on Long Island since the Shoreham nuclear power station. It's bad for the environment. It's bad for public safety. It sets the precedent of industrializing Long Island Sound, and it's something that should be overwhelmingly rejected.
You raised the issue of Shoreham. People said, hey, if you don't want nuclear energy, what do you want? I mean, here's natural gas, says Broadwater. I mean, people have to run their machinery on something, and we'll provide the energy.
Well, there's nothing wrong with natural gas, and there are other options and other alternatives available to provide natural gas to Long Island, including several projects, pipeline projects that are already pending. So it's not that natural gas is a bad form of energy. It's the idea of setting up a platform in the middle of Long Island Sound. That's the bad idea. It's in the wrong place. It is in close proximity to millions of people. It is in an environmentally sensitive area that New York State has spent several $100 million trying to clean up, and this just runs right in the face of that.
And the area you're talking about, the Long Island Sound.
Long Island Sound, that's right. I mean, there have been great problems in the Long Island Sound. We included the Sound as part of the Federal National Estuary Program, part of our Clean Water Bond Act in the state of New York going back to 1996 was a separate appropriation to clean up Long Island Sound. It makes no sense to spend all of those tax dollars to clean up Long Island Sound and then allow some private company to come in with a project and pollute it all over again.
Now, New York's Governor, Eliot Spitzer, seems to hold the most important card in terms of stopping Broadwater. How do you think he'll play that card?
Well, the card is a very important one. It's under the Coastal Zone Management Program, where New York State can say no to Broadwater. And so far, the governor has been silent, and he keeps postponing his decision. And I think that's caused a great deal of concern among Long Islanders, because to almost every other elected official, certainly to Long Island elected officials, the issue of Broadwater is obvious, and that is that we should say no to Broadwater. But the governor has yet to make a decision, and that has made a lot of people very uncomfortable and very uncertain as to the outcome.
If the governor in the end supports Broadwater, is there anything that the state legislature can do to override the governor on this?
Well, I think it would be hard. even if we were able to pass legislation, it would be subject to a veto power. There are various bills that have been put forth in the state legislature. This Broadwater natural gas platform is going to be anchored to state land. I mean, one of the things we could say is not give them permission to use state land. But if the governor is going to be out there vetoing it and then putting pressure to try to sustain that veto, that would make it very difficult. If the governor says yes to Broadwater, which I hope he does not, our greatest ally and our greatest strategy, I think, is going to be the court system. That's how we ended up, really putting a great deal of pressure on Lilco and Shoreham until ultimately the state government had to lead the way and pull the plug on the Shoreham nuclear power station. So from my perspective, the governor must say no. If he does not, the best avenue may be the courts after that, because this project is clearly going to have an adverse impact on the environment, and the state and federal government would have to ignore that, and I think illegally ignore that, if they're going to approve this project.
Dick Amper, what's your opposition to Broadwater based on?
It's the biggest threat to Long Island since the Shoreham nuclear power plant. It'd be real bad for the environment. It set a terrible precedent. We don't want Long Island Sound looking like the Gulf Coast off the coast of Louisiana or Texas, industrializing the Sound, and absolutely a major a threat for an accident or a terrorist attack. It's just wrong in every way, and anybody who thinks that this would actually save money, that Shell Oil is bringing Broadwater to Long Island because it wants to reduce energy costs, I got to cross Sound Bridge to sell them.
As to the argument by Broadwater that the region needs the natural gas,
Long Island wouldn't get 20% of the natural gas from Broadwater in the first place. We're already too dependent on natural gas. If there were any shortage in supply, we'd be in very, very serious trouble. We need to be weaning ourselves off fossil fuels, and even if you wanted natural gas, Broadwater is the worst possible way to bring it to us.
why?
This is really untested. It has enormous potential for environmental harm to Long Island Sound. There are adequate supplies of natural gas. There are other ways of getting there, even other ways of actually shipping them in and using this kind of process that would be far less hazardous than doing this on Long Island Sound. We've spent hundreds of millions of dollars to protect this resource, and to turn it over to a multinational corporation backed by big oil committed to importing fossil fuels forever is about the worst energy policy I can imagine.
Could you elaborate on what you see are the alternatives?
Well, clearly we have already supported, sometimes reluctantly, the Iroquois pipeline, the Islander East pipeline. We have one crossing the Hudson River, a power line coming up the South Shore. Environmentalists have really understood the pressing need for energy and have had to look the other way or subordinate our concerns about the environment. But you don't want a ticking time bomb like this that is really not helping Long Island economically, environmentally, or in terms of energy, sitting out in really one of the Northeast's greatest natural treasures.
Now, Governor Eliot Spitzer of New York seems to hold a very important place in this process. What do you think he's going to do?
It's really hard to say what he's going to do. The New York State Department of State has more influence in the process, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's process, than any other state agency. Of course, that state agency works for the governor, and so how the governor feels about this will certainly influence the Department of State's recommendations, I believe. In addition, we have great opposition to Broadwater from the Long Island congressional delegation, especially Senators Clinton and Schumer. You get a powerful Democratic governor advocating the other way. That may weaken the resolve of our senators and congresspeople to fight this in Washington. So we're very, very concerned that he get this right.
As to the process, do you see it as fair and democratic?
The process is the worst thing I've ever seen in 25 years of environmentalism. Ordinarily, our job as environmentalists is to explain to the public the pros and cons of a project. They in turn talk to their public officials and express their view as you do in a democracy, and the public officials are expected to act responsibly. Here, we've done that job. The public is universally opposed to the project. Most elected officials think it's the worst idea going, and we might still get it because of the regulatory schema in Washington involving the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It's about as undemocratic as any process we've ever been in. We could all hate this project and still wind up stuck with it.